Next up is our next panel discussion. We're talking about bridging the gap, how to communicate, how to speak to the public. We have representatives from like two major Chicago area universities here, University of Chicago and Northwestern. And without further ado, I want to ask my panelists to join me. First up from the Science and Communications program at the University of Chicago, Peggy Mason. She's professor of neurobiology at the University of Chicago. Welcome. Then Sarah Saritella, Director of Communications of the Institute for Translational Medicine and lecturer at the University of Chicago. Welcome. Then from Northwestern, Kiki Zisimopoulos, I hope that was kind of correct, Assistant Professor of Instruction, McCormick School of Engineering at Northwestern. And Beth Bennett, Associated Dean and Professor of Journalism at Medill School of Journalism, Media, Integrated Marketing and Communications. Welcome. So I'd like to start out with the University of Chicago. If you could go ahead and give a brief introduction of your program, what you're doing, what you're working on.
Happy to. Thank you so much. So at the University of Chicago, we have built the first 4-credit science communications program for scientists. So yes, there are programs out there that teach communications, but we focus specifically for scientists, those going into medicine, researchers. And we have built a program that revolves around knowing and engaging your audience so that then you can have the opportunity to inform and inspire people to change the world. We've done that with a robust undergraduate program. We've had wait lists for every course that we've put together under this model, and where people actually our students get real world experience, both the theory and the practice for writing and applying these skills, which we look forward to diving into in just a moment. But first, we wanted to take you behind the scenes to see a quick little video to show how we work to make our students comfortable, because you can only learn when you are comfortable enough to get outside and at the edge of your comfort zone. Before we play that video, anything else you wanted to add, Peggy? All right, take it away, behind the scenes. Drum roll, dun dun dun.
I think now it should be fine. Oh.
Well, while, of course, technical elements are a natural part of any conference and convention, we'll give them a few minutes for pulling that video up. But as you can see from here, I'll give you a little preface. We do drills. In this course, they're learning how to give a dynamic talk to a public audience, which also applies for research, right? Who here has been into a room where there's been a snooze fest going on? Boring slides, yeah, monotone, yeah, okay. So we help get rid of those things and give them the skills and the storytelling abilities to really bring that into the real world. And one of the drills that has been a favorite among our students is what you'll see in this Dinosaurs Eating Bananas.
Dinosaurs are eating bananas.
Dinosaurs are eating bananas.
Dinosaurs are eating bananas. Dinosaurs are eating bananas.
We have a final filming day where they give their talks. Get out of their shells.
The skills that I learned from science communications and learning how to structure a really sticky, attention-grabbing, interesting story, and I got an A on my thesis, and I'm graduating with honors.
So that's within the school. The Dinosaurs Are Eating Banana, it's a Mad Lib, okay? 90% of communication is nonverbal, right? So they pick words and then for a minute solid need to deliver that same sentence in as many different ways as possible. So they learn and have to get uncomfortable with coming up with different combinations and tell a story with a sentence that makes no sense, but to try to communicate that through their vocal delivery and body language to their audience. So that's in there, and you saw how a student was actually able to apply it to get an award for her thesis in the building, but our students also know that they use this to apply and change the world outside. Play the video over to you, part 2. Here's a comment from a student about the importance as a scientist learning this.
And it should hopefully come up any moment
Any
now.
moment now, right?
Research is just relegated to the scientific world, that it just gets stuck in there. And it doesn't go to the people who need it. And so that's why it's really important that like science communication breaks everything down.
She was an alum of our program, and our students have gone on to already apply those skills in building websites, telling stories, putting together videos from organ transplant teams and how they actually fly across the country and bring life-saving organs to people. All these things on their own. So we're really proud of what they've done and are excited for this next generation. And over to you, Peggy, for other additions and favorite parts of the course that we put together so far.
Yeah, it's just so heartening to see what the students do. They learn that the communication is essentially a performance. When they're doing a video communication, they have to be performers, and they have to put themselves out, and they have to show their enthusiasm in order for anyone else to be interested. When we're talking about writing, it's the same thing. It's teaching these young people that what interests them may not be what interests the person on the street. And they've really got to make it applicable. I can say that the way I got into talking to the public was when a piece of my research went, I wouldn't call it viral, I would call it sort of semi-bacterial or something. And I talked to a lot of people, and I really enjoyed it. And then the university asked me to make a massively open online course, which I was very happy to do. And when I was organizing that, I didn't have an audience. So I had to invent an audience. And it really wasn't going that spectacularly well for about 3 weeks. And then my producer says to me, you've got to have some picture of who you're talking to. And that afternoon on the train, my commuter train, my conductor told me he had signed up for the course. And I thought, oh my God, I have got to make this interesting, because I know how hard he works. He works all day long on the train. You don't know, the metro is a tough job. It's a really tough job. And at the end of the day, he goes home, he cooks meal. I knew his wife was sick. I knew that he had a lot of things on his mind. And if I don't grab his attention and have a really good reason for him to listen to me, he's not going to listen to me. Even though he's interested. He wouldn't have signed up if he wasn't interested. So I have this picture of a person who has worked all day long, has just fed the kids, is doing the dishes, and has an iPad right there, and wants to learn something, but I have to meet them. And that's what we teach these students. You know, why is that interesting? Why is that interesting? Not to you, to everyone. Why is that human interest? And it's all about human interest.
There's a human core to every science element and story, and conflict and emotion. And we teach people to be detectives, dig it up, find it, so that you can share it with the world so it sticks.
Thank you so much. It's very inspiring. I think we have a lot of questions about that, and I would hand it over to Northwestern. If you could talk briefly about your program.
Can I have the slide up, please, for this? Thank you.
Insert Jeopardy music here.
Yes, exactly. Dun, 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 dun. It's going to come up.
Okay, great. Perfect. There we go. So I want to just briefly introduce you to the offerings at Northwestern. One thing I do want to highlight is that the courses you just heard about at UChicago are for undergraduates. And then these courses, I just want to point out, are actually for our graduate students. And I have two offerings that I want to briefly discuss. So on your left, you see the Research Communication Training Program. This is we just celebrated our 10th anniversary. It's the 10th year of offering this program. And it is an interactive and team-taught in-person course. We also start with improv. And our first instructor actually has a theater background. So he has a theater and improv background. And the purpose of that is just to get the students out of their shells. It is often very terrifying for them. So we want to just break the ice and get them into this sort of, let me try things, they may or may not work. So we start off with that module. Our second module is actually taught by Beth Bennett, who we have here today from the journalism school. And in this module, Beth discusses storytelling, jargon, so we start to get into the content of their talk now that they're all warmed up. And then she also throws them a little bit in the deep end, and the picture you see here is a student from this summer at our studio at Medill, and Beth has them do interviews. So what they might experience, with a journalist, and we film and give them feedback. And so again, a lot of just getting them to actually do things and practice. And then the instructors after that, one discusses graphic design to help the students put together their slides. And then we do some workshopping and also quite a bit of peer feedback. One thing I heard from students is that that's actually one of the most important aspects of the course is just getting feedback in different perspectives. These students come from all different disciplines, and so they get feedback that they would not normally get in their lab. So that's the RCTP course, and the QR code will take you to our website where you can see some example videos that our students have completed. The last thing I'll say about this course is that the students have two choices. They can either do a live symposium, we call it 7 minutes of scholarship, and so they get up and present their 7-minute talk, or they can choose to self-produce with the help of an expert, a video, a shorter 2 to 3 minute video that they can also use for their LinkedIn or their website. So they do have that option. On the right is an NSF-funded program, recognizing that not all students are fortunate enough to have access to these in-person opportunities. We developed, from the basis of RCTP, what we call SCOPE, the Science Communication Online Program. And this is an online asynchronous program. And the screenshot here is what a student might see. So they'll watch a video and do some exercises. And then here we have students from all over. And again, that QR code will take you to the website. You'll see that our participants have come from all over the world with this program. So these two in parallel are Northwestern's graduate level offerings. Anything I missed?
I think you got it all.
Okay, thank you so much. This morning we had some discussions between scientists here in the room about like how to go about communicating what they do. Some were like, we should go out there, do more, put content out like on social media, reach out ourselves. Others were saying, I'm a scientist, so I have my network of like science journalists, but I want them to do the job. I want them then to like break it down to an audience so that they can understand it. One way or another, why is it important for scientists to be good, efficient communicators? Whoever wants. Maybe Beth, as you haven't.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that. First of all, I love this idea, like, do I do it myself? Or do I develop a relationship with a really good journalist who I really trust? And I actually think both approaches are great approaches. As a journalist and someone who is at the Medill School of Journalism, we teach journalists to understand, interpret, to have knowledge of research and science so they can be good storytellers and interpreters. And so I think that's a really important thing to honor. But I also think we see more and more scientists being able to take their own work and put it out for public consumption and hopefully get non-peers, non-scientists interested in their work. And so I think both sort of strategies work. And, you know, sometimes it's sort of knowing yourself, right? Where are you most comfortable? I do think developing storytelling skills is sort of a muscle. And so if you're sort of more like, I prefer to give it to a journalist I trust, which is great. But I do think there are aspects of storytelling and communication that can easily be developed and worked on over time. So I tell students it's sort of like a yoga practice, like you're never done, you're never there, you're always kind of building on it over time incrementally, and maybe you'll be good at one piece of it and maybe another piece not so much, and so you kind of focus there or slowly try to add to your skill set.
Completely agree. The two-pronged approach is so important for a few reasons. Number one, those storytelling skills, whether you are talking to a journalist or you are trying to get more funding for your research or get some donors from your university involved, you need to be able to tell your story. You need to get people to care. And being able to have that skill set to quickly get people to think and feel. Science shows, as we know, that when people feel really strong emotion, positive or negative, they're more likely to act. So when you use those elements, it will help your career, whether or not you're going to talk to a journalist. If you are going to talk to a journalist, as a former journalist myself, I'm gonna Google you. If I'm putting together a video package, I want to know if you are going to be able to speak clearly on air and in a video. Because if we have a 10-minute conversation and you're using a ton of jargon and I can't pull out that little quote, that soundbite that I need, I'm going to need to try to find somebody else. Because there's a 24-hour news cycle. Everyone is really tight on time. If you can make the reporter's life easy, then you will be their go-to source. And it actually helps you build that relationship with those science journalists. The other cool thing is that now more than ever online, you have access to a free world where you can put up a website, you can have a TikTok or a YouTube channel. There are some people with more followers on their TikTok and YouTube than subscribe or follow to major media outlets. Think about that. The New York Times, CNN. You can build your own platform and be able to put more context there. So if you have a two-pronged approach, yes, build relationships with science journalists, get your work out there, but also own your own story as a researcher and share the work that you're doing so you don't have to wait for that call. And if someone isn't interested in the story, that's okay. You can put it out there, and then maybe that will actually be the thing that garnishes that interest and has another reporter reach out to you.
I'll just add one thing, which is I do both. And I actually love talking to journalists. I find in most instances that they're so skilled. They're so good at what they do. And they take me out of my, I can weed out or nerd out like the rest of the scientists. So talking to a journalist, they can take flights of fancy that are a little bit more difficult for me. And so there really is a role for them. The other thing that I would add is, as somebody earlier today said, why should we communicate to the public? Well, the public pays us. We work for them. They're my employer. That is how science works. I don't think this is optional. I think this is absolute. I think it's the only ethical thing to do.
So how would you say that your students benefit from those programs? Also, what I think, if as a scientist already while you're in school, you learn how to communicate, maybe the barrier then is lower to go and communicate, because you're not okay, I'm a scientist, but I'm not an expert in communication. Would you say that's one of the benefits that comes from your programs?
Yeah, for sure. I also, so I can share some things that students have told me about the benefits of the program. One actually came from, so I was previously at the University of Chicago. One of our students raised her hand in the middle of the course and said, I never thought I'd learn so much science in a communication course. It's yeah, exactly, right? Our students were talking about all different disciplines, all different areas, and in the process of figuring out how they could best communicate it, they were also teaching their peers. So we very much, or I should say, I very much view communication as a form of teaching. So they also learn science. And then another thing that the students benefit from, I mentioned earlier, are just the different perspectives. Especially at the grad level, you're in your lab and you're surrounded by people who think the same way as you do about your field. And then when you're suddenly asked to explain it to a historian or to someone, from the English department or to a journalist, it makes them realize, oh, maybe I either don't fully understand this, or I need new terms, I need new words and ways of describing it. So that other perspective they really value.
I would also add that I think it helps them explain what they do to their families. So some of our students have a hard time explaining their work to the people in their life. And so I think there's a benefits beyond sort of public communication. And also, I tend to think it helps students to enjoy story more. So students will say to me, we teach narrative structure, so we teach sort of the structure of how stories happen and how we feel emotion as a story unfolds. And so students will say to me, I can't watch Game of Thrones anymore without picking it apart, or without going to a movie and really just sitting there and thinking all about the structure. And I think that's great. It creates, I think, more sort of joy in storytelling in sort of all aspects of life.
I think one thing from this morning is also that there's a broad interest, general interest in science, but that for some reasons, like multiple reasons, neither scientists nor we journalists, to some extent, know how to reach those people, how to connect with them. And I want to circle back to you, Peggy, what you said about your conductor, and that you need to get that human touch, that human interest. So how do you teach, or which advices do you give your students to number one, know who they want to reach, and how they want to reach those people?
You just have to take yourself out of the I got trained as a scientist and put yourself into the I'm a human being category. So I'll give you an example. I also wrote a textbook, and the textbook is on neurobiology, and there's a lot of textbooks on neurobiology. This is for medical students. And if you look at a textbook on neurobiology, all the others, they'll talk to you about, when they're talking to you about locomotion, they'll talk to you about leeches and how leeches swim. And they might get up to how a cat walks-ish. But really, they're talking about leeches. Well, these medical students have a lot to learn. They do not have time for leeches. And we are not leeches. And there's actually a lot of science about how we walk. So even though the zeitgeist is that I should teach them about leeches, I didn't do that. I just decided I'm going to teach them about walking. And what is walking? Gait plus balance. Okay, that alone tells you a lot. Gait plus balance. And so I think you just have to say, you have to be willing to say, I am a nerd and I love this. This is super, super interesting to me, and it is not important or relevant to this person. I can't make the argument that it needs 5 minutes of their time. So that's what you really need to do. Remember who you are. Talk to your mom, talk to your dad, talk to your brother. My brothers are okay. If I talk to my mom, she's the most scientific one in my family. But if I talk to my brothers, they could care less. So if I can convince them that something's interesting, then we're good to go. Talk to the people in your life.
Share your passion. Also, transfer that emotion that you have for.
I mean, that's the other thing. Content, unfortunately, and this is sort of a sad fact, enthusiasm counts for so much more than content. Anyone who teaches knows that. There's a bad side to that, actually. I was on a science communication panel this morning where somebody brought up the fact that the people who are, for example, anti-vaxxers are extremely charismatic and extremely enthusiastic. So that fact, that enthusiasm counts more than content, is a neutral fact. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. We need to use it for good.
And one of the things we specifically do in class with our frameworks is we ask our students why over and over again. Why should anyone care? Oh, it's my science, of course everyone should, but why? Why should that person across the street care? Why should anybody care? And what, to the passion point, gets you so excited that you want to get out of bed every morning and do this? When you're in science, right, you dedicate your life to studying something for the hopes that it moves on and does something to change the world. So why the heck do you care? Why did you get into it? And when you start to feel that energy is contagious. And we've had some pretty interesting answers from our students with that. And we keep going back. Okay, why? You got to push, really get people to dig into that core.
Mm. Communicating science in general can be quite challenging because you are talking about very complex matters. And I would say in the last couple of years, there was an added challenge, which we have seen during the COVID pandemic, that we kind of live in a post-factual world where some parts of the population cannot agree with the other part that the sky is blue. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but like you talked about vaccines, we talked about like COVID, that people say COVID, it's a hoax, it's nothing. So how can we, or how do you teach your students to address those people who, to some degree, might be lost to us, to facts, to science? Difficult question, I know.
That's a good question, though. That's it, but it's a very difficult question. I don't know that we talk specifically about disinformation unless it happens in other areas. I do think we talk about sort of having a sense of authority, and students struggle with this because being enthusiastic and being performative sometimes doesn't feel like you're also presenting a sense of authority. And that's a struggle that students kind of bring to us, which is I want to be fun or funny or interesting or have enthusiasm, but then won't that undercut my authority as a researcher? Will people really believe me if I'm acting silly or if I'm acting in a way that doesn't seem becoming of a scholar? And I think that's a real struggle, especially for students who are PhD candidates and just kind of trying to come into their own in the field. And so, of course, I'm like, go ahead and be silly, it'll be fine, but I get their legitimate concern over it. Interestingly, I think it's important that they own sort of their authentic selves and are able to be comfortable doing that and still feel a sense of authority. And we tell them all the time, we're like, you're getting a PhD from Northwestern University. You're studying with one of the premier scholars in this area. Like, why would you worry about this sense of authority? But they do. So that doesn't directly answer your question, but I think it gets at it a little bit, which is why would people believe you versus someone else?
Yeah, and I'll just add, we also tell our students that in many fields there are misconceptions and that they should be aware of those. So again, it's go out, talk to people, find out what these misconceptions are so that you can come in prepared, knowing what you're up against. Don't go in blind, assuming that people are just going to follow you along on your path on the story that you're telling.
Mm.
We've actually built a course on how to tackle misinformation and battle it. And one of the things that we teach is harnessing the power of storytelling as a tool, because stories are universal. And if you look at the people spreading misinformation, you note that they are often telling a story for evil, getting that emotion across, not necessarily with facts, but as scientists, we have the beauty of having the facts on our side. And so if you can know your audience enough to find a story that matters to them, and weave it in, the story acts as a Trojan horse in transmitting the right information and helping to address that misinformation to really help change that tide.
Now, within your institutions, how difficult, challenging is it to convince students to say, like, I'm studying physics and I want to focus on that, I don't want to bother with communication? How difficult is it to explain it to them and convince them that that's also an important part of their education, maybe?
Not difficult.
No.
So we have a waiting list, and what's funny is that our students, they'll be working on their projects, and their roommates will say, "Oh God, I wish we had this for social sciences or for humanities," because in reality, what we teach them, we're applying it to science. It doesn't have to be applied to science. It's how you talk to people with. And I really dislike the idea that one has to dumb down. You do not. 100%, I take exception to that. What you need to do is to be you have to know your stuff enough to say it simply and clearly, and truth. So I go for clear, accessible, and true. I try to tell no lies. That's difficult. But if you tell no lies, then what's simple and clear is actually also interesting to people who know a little bit more. It's both accessible and it takes the people who know something a little bit farther.
Your students are of course, on the younger side. Is there also maybe with older peers, a certain misconception, like I'm exaggerating now, but saying like, I don't want to dance my research on TikTok. Like, is that something that you have to like deal with sometimes?
Great question. And you do not have to dance your research on TikTok. There are other ways. We do actually, we a couple of things. One, we've launched a master's program that's going to be starting in 2024. So if anybody's interested, check it out. The Master's in Biological Sciences. There's a science comms track where you can take the courses that we're talking about. But within that, undergrads, grad students, they really see the value here. We have junior faculty who we provide training for through at the Institute for Translational Medicine on how to talk on camera. Senior faculty have taken a little bit more time to come around. When they've started seeing the impacts of science comms and how their peers, who may be younger, are appearing in the news and who are getting acknowledgments for their research, then we started having people come to us and say, hey, could we get your advice on this? Hey, actually, I want to understand how to do Y or Z. And to Beth's point about being able to share what they're doing for the first time, we've actually had folks who've been in their fields for like 50 years work with us and then say, oh my gosh, for the first time, my wife and kids understand what I'm doing with my life. And that was everything for them. Like, it didn't matter the media. They're like, my family understands what I've done with my whole life now. So I think the tide has shifted. It's been a culture shift over the last maybe 5 to 7 years, but we're getting there where it's starting to really take off.
Is it also important to teach to your students to also openly communicate what we don't know? I'm like now speaking to you as like communicational experts, because if we think back at the pandemic, their messaging shifted a lot between like, we have to get vaccinated to stop the spread. And it was like, no, we have to get vaccinated to like mitigate the diseases, like, or also on masks. So is that something that you teach them also maybe as lessons from the pandemic, when all of us, like journalists, scientists, politicians, were kind of like flying blind for a certain time? And so of course messaging changed because also research changed. Is that something that you teach them, that we also need to be maybe more open about what we don't know?
Yeah, I'll add that one of the tactics some of our students use in telling their stories, some of them struggle, like, I don't know how to make this relevant for my audience. My research is so niche that I'm having a hard time thinking of a way of beginning my talk that will be interesting to people. And one strategy we suggest is to tell them, like, tell the story and then say, and here's what we don't know. And this is what I'm trying to figure out. So tap into that curiosity and be upfront about, this is what science still hasn't figured out. And what's so exciting is that this is what I'm working on. I'm working on, like, you know, cracking this one little part of it. And that curiosity piece can be a really effective tool.
We also draw from media training techniques, because we're not just teaching sort of how to tell sort of a discrete story where you're the only storyteller, but also how to tell story through interview. Because a lot of what scientists do to communicate their research is talk with journalists, and that's basically storytelling through conversation. And so part of what we teach are tactics that are often used in media training, and we even look at combative interview situations where, not that this would happen to anybody here, but where a journalist is really, really questioning someone in an uncomfortable way. And we sort of practice how to say, you know, that's not my area of research, that's outside of the scope of my research, but here's what I can tell you, or here's where my research is. And I tell students that they're sort of like, it's totally fine to say, I don't know, or that's outside of the scope of my research, unless you should know, because sometimes you probably should know the answer and you don't. And that's a different tactic. That's a little bit, that requires a little more finesse. But I think it's important for students, or for students who do our program, to come out knowing that they should not ever feel forced to say anything, that they hold the power to determine what they're going to say and what they're not going to say, and that they can draw the lines around their expertise.
Such a good point. And with the pandemic is a wonderful case study of how science comms can go very wrong. I do not think that a well enough job was done to educate the public on the fact that science is always changing. From day one, when this pandemic hit, a recurring theme should have been, This may change next week, next month. This is what we know as of this date. There was not enough of that. So then you had people flipping, saying, well, you said this with such authority and that we all needed to take this action on this date, and now you're saying this. Whereas if you can prevent that problem by setting expectations for the change, and that science is not a one and done, it is an ongoing exploration, there were a lot of opportunities to use that to help change the tide.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Science isn't a set of facts, it's a process. And we don't communicate that enough. And it's hard to do, I will grant you, because you also want to communicate. If you're a scientist, you want to communicate the facts. And so somewhere along the line, you have to also alert people to the fact that everything's true until it's not true. And I don't think we've done a great job at that. I'm not quite sure how to do a great job at that.
As much as I enjoy talking to you, I don't want to have like the monopoly of asking questions. So I'd like to open it up to the floor. So if there are any questions, please, gentlemen in the front, to the left.
Be honest. If you don't know it, just say, I don't know it yet. I might know it next week, in 2 weeks, and communicate if you were wrong, if your results were wrong. I mean, but in a respectful way. And this is the same if you communicate to public. I mean, just say, okay, we don't know it yet. We just try to ramble on and find answers on the way. And if you were wrong, just excuse yourself, and that's it. It should be the same for politicians as well for researchers. I mean, that's how we should do it.
Of course. I don't know should be a staple, but I don't particularly think I don't know does a ton for anyone. So a much better way of saying it, well, that's a possibility, and I think it's a real possibility because of X, Y, and Z. On the other hand, there's A, B, and C that makes me think that that's not the case. And that's a much more interesting way to go. It takes more time. And at the same time, you're also balancing this. So for example, when I taught medical students, I was teaching them things that I wanted them to remember 30 years from now. Not the weeds that they could forget or look up on Google and it didn't matter, but stuff that I didn't want them to ever have to look up, and I wanted them to always remember it. So those things are, with very few exceptions, those are truths. They're science successes. And so to put in time to tell them the unsureness is I haven't figured that out completely. I take your point. I don't think it's that easy to do.
If I could just add to that, sometimes we're sort of talking about disinformation, but I think about as a former working journalist, I used to look at a piece of research and not completely understand it, and I would start with a question like, oh, so it looks like your research is about this, because I had no idea. I was just like, I'm going to throw this out there and hope that you will educate me, because I don't know. And so that probably wasn't the best way to go about it, but I started as a journalist when I was 22 years old. And sometimes I think when a journalist at least throws that out there, I hear sometimes scientists saying like, well, no, that's not really what my work is about. And that's like such a missed opportunity, because it automatically sort of kicks off the dialogue in a negative kind of way. But also, often journalists, especially journalists who do not routinely cover science, they really just want you to talk and help them understand, and they're just trying to get the conversation going. So I think, to your point, a better way of saying that is to even sort of ignore the first part of the question and be like, well, let me tell you what my work is really about, and just get into it. So
I can agree with that. Yeah. I mean, very often, like us, we're covering like everything that happens in the US, and so sometimes also science, but I unfortunately have very little time then to like really dig into it. So if the if the scientist can take me by the hand a little bit, of course I try to prepare as much as possible, but every help is appreciated, if I may add that. Any other questions? There in the back.
Like the idea of using storytelling in order to mitigate disinformation. And I think this is something that a lot of scientists in the room during the pandemic have probably encountered a lot. Hey, so, you're like a scientist, tell me about these vaccinations and, all of these things. And maybe some other people share this experience that I really felt like I'm hitting a wall. So I was hoping if you could give us a specific example of how you would use storytelling in order to mitigate disinformation in the public.
Yeah, great question. And in giving a specific recipe, would need to, maybe we can even talk more after if you have a specific example, but in general, for a toolkit for everybody, do not run away from the conflict. Embrace the conflict. Every good story across the ages has had conflict. Romeo and Juliet, if they met, fell madly in love, families got along, they lived happily ever after, nobody would remember them, right? So conflict is part of what makes a story sticky. Instead of avoiding it, which we often do in academia, right, at universities, you need to embrace it, address it, make that key in your story, because then you have a cause for everyone to rally behind. And what makes things viral and catch on is when people feel a very strong emotion. And so whether it's a vaccine, whether it's that, 5G's frying our brain, whether it's anything, you can bring and boil that one core conflict into a story where there is a human face and name, or whether it is your own conflict and struggle in trying to address something. Tying in universal experiences like love, loss, frustration, which we've all felt in science and in the world outside. Having those universal experiences is core to fighting misinformation. One of the other many hats I wear, I'm a licensed private detective, and our family firm helps get innocent people out of prison. You have to be able to connect with people from any background, the roughest cities of, Chicago to boardrooms and corporate and, celebrities. And there are universal elements of being a human that are core. And when we're fighting misinformation, we have to take our ego out of it and some of those emotions that might lead to knee jerks of how could you even think that? Empathy is number one. Your audience is thinking that for a reason. And being able to look into who that is and why will allow you to craft a specific story and narrative to address it so that you are coming together under a shared win-win instead of this combative where you're shoving people into a corner, and it then is a lose-lose. And so I'd be happy to talk about specific examples because the story's going to be different for every single one. But in general, those are some things that you can use. Yeah.
If I may, one example that we've seen a lot, on social media or in the media as well, is fact-checking. Is that a good tool, or is there also the danger that it's too much top-down, I'm the teacher and I'm saying, no, you're wrong about all of that?
Great question. If you're going on a fact-checking angle, a cool way to connect with your audience is to go on the journey with them. Ooh, I heard this. Is it true? Maybe this wasn't, not sure. And talk about the emotions as if you are that little detective going into it with them. Oh, I was surprised to find this. Here's the sourcing here. But it can't just be according to this source, X, Y, and Z. People's eyes glaze over, and then there's no human connection.
One of the tools that we work with our students on in the improv session, our instructor uses yes and a lot. And it's to get the students into this space of trying to find common ground. And so, he'll have these various activities where they just have to build on what the person before them did. And so they have to find how can I connect? How can I add to that rather than that was stupid? Why are you acting like you're shoveling? Why would you do that? They have to roll with it and just find that common ground. And I think that's one way some of these practicing these skills and getting out of that headspace of no, that's wrong can also be really helpful.
And if you look at, MIT has done really cool research where they found that tweets, you're on Twitter, retweeting for false information is 70% more likely than true information. That's terrifying, right? And false information spreading faster. If you have true information, it takes 6 times as long to reach the same 1,000 people. Why? Because there are people using storytelling without the facts who are spreading it, which is why we're all here today and helping spread the word and make these tools accessible, because you have to fight it. You can't unring the bell. People are still citing that autism vaccine study from way back when that person was prosecuted. That was taken back, but it was so sticky, it was in people's heads. So you have to make sure that everybody here has those tools with which to use it for good instead of evil.
Any further questions from the audience? How have your programs changed throughout the time? Like, because I mean, media and like our surroundings and social media changing so quickly, and I mean now we're like in this not totally post-pandemic but still age. How did you adapt the programs as you also learned what your students needed? And yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing we did is I had mentioned we added the giving students a choice. So yes, you can do a live presentation, but recognizing that students are going to have a digital presence. And so giving them that option to learn how to do some video editing and create a much shorter video that would work well on a personal website or a LinkedIn page. That was one thing. And then we were fortunate actually during the pandemic. So the online program that I mentioned, it actually was created in 2019. And so we were fortunate enough that we were able to pivot during the pandemic and leverage some of that online asynchronous content to still reach our students and still continue the program throughout the pandemic.
We've started teaching more social media. So not only have we given people the skills to write a story for a lay audience and distill science, but then once you've got the story, great. How do you get anybody to read it? That's where that engaging component comes in. So how do you not only write the story, but writing for social media is an art and a strategy, and you can use hooks to get people to learn and click. It must always be accurate. It must not overpromise. But there are ways that you cannot be boring, and you can tap into those emotional components. And we've had students express an interest for more of that because of everyone being locked down during the pandemic for a while. You can't share things in traditional ways. Everything went digital and on social.
Yes, Mr. Fassmann.
How do you measure the success? How do you measure the success of your courses? Because I'm sure the courses will cost some money, and the president will ask, is this money good invested? So how you measure?
Excellent question. It's a two-pronged approach of data and stories, because showing that, to your president or whomever is making decisions that it's of value, you need to tap into that. So there are course reviews after every class. Students give anonymous reviews. We also do debriefs with students and ask them specific questions and get stories about how they've helped and applied it in their own lives. We've had students go on to get jobs in science communications, go on to med school, get research grants, do some really cool work because of the things in the class. And we are starting to do some more tracking as we go into social media to look at social listening and tracking of how far things are going. But those are just some of the metrics. So we have actual surveys with data plus stories that we marry together. Anything you wanted to add to that, Peggy?
We do two things as well. So when our students enter the program, they use a rubric to self-evaluate. So they record themselves presenting a video, and then they self-evaluate themselves at the very beginning of the course. And then they do the exact same thing at the end of the course, so we can detect their self-perception of change. And then right now we have an IRB-approved study where we are taking the pre and post videos and sending them to undergrads and asking the undergrads to use this rubric to evaluate the clarity of the message, and to also tell us what they think the message was. And then we are in the process of, we want to compare what the students think the message was to what the speaker intended the message to be, to see if that alignment improves as a result of the program.
And our program is about 10 years. It is 10 years old. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. We do course teacher evaluations, but 2 years ago, I went back to some of the alums who had started early on and did some qualitative work around sort of what it's meant to them kind of a couple years out. And that was helpful in thinking through sort of like, how do we revise? How do we modify? How are they using it? And I was so pleased to hear that they feel such a comfort level in communication, and that for some of them, it led them to do things that they wouldn't have done otherwise, like take on speaking engagements or do more teaching work that they were interested in doing, or do interviews with journalists that they might not have done otherwise. So I think that was also important to kind of go back and talk to some of the alums.
Is there also a shift within the scientific community? Because of course, like publishing your research in like scientific magazines is very important, but at the same time also like building another presence. Is that now something that also people see who then might like pour funds into your programs, like as a scientist? Is there a shift or not yet?
Yeah. I think it's a double-edged sword.
Right.
I think there are a lot of scientists who look down on scientists who communicate to the public. That's the old view. It's still around in a great part. And then there are those of us, I guess, I'm old and tenured, and so I don't care. Mm-hmm. So I like doing it. And there are a bunch of people that like doing it, but I don't think that it's not the mode amongst biology-minded scientists anyway. I think there are some fields where it's a little bit more the mode. Psychology happens to be one where they very much, a lot of them engage with the public. And the other field, and it's sort of predictable, is astrophysics, because they need the public. And so they do engage with the public because the public is funding their telescopes. Mm-hmm. But biologists, I would say most people, the reaction to me was, oh, Peggy, you're going to have to dumb down your science. You're going to dumb down neuroscience. How could you do that?
And in the publishing world, it is interesting because there's an altmetric score now that folks may be familiar with if you've done research over here too, where it tracks not just your research publication, but the reach of it. So yes, you could have citations, but it's also where is it getting play in the media? Where is it getting online and in blogs? And people are looking at as a metric for your success as a scientist and a researcher. That didn't used to be around like 20 years ago. So there is this shift where yes, there's the old guard where some people are like, not so sure about SciComms, but then there are these institutions and platforms being built that actually use it as a measure of career success.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if anyone works at a university that uses Interfolio, which measures sort of faculty activity reporting, but it also draws those sorts of citations and looks at that type of communication, which is interesting for some of the students who come through our program who do plan to have a career in the academy. So one more reason for them to be great communicators.
Mm-hmm. One last thing also is, we talked about that earlier this morning, is also that the trust issue is also a question of like relatability, like that you see people who look yet like yourself, who are talking about the issues. And I mean, I'm growing up to be one, but it's mostly old white men that like if you watch panel discussions or like TV shows, like they are very often the first ones to jump, like even when we call universities, like the first ones who would say yes are elderly white men. I don't know, they like are more confident. So with your programs, you have like students from like all backgrounds. So do you think that by that you can also change it, that like we can see more, I don't know, Latinas, more like Black women, more like a bigger diversity of scientists that are communicating in the public?
Yes, and there's nothing wrong with an old white guy who is
like,
fabulous at communicating science. So what's our gumball guy? What the hell was his name? Oh my God. No. Anyway, I can't think of his name right now.
I didn't want to stigmatize
so,
them because
so
I'm
brilliant.
going to be one. So.
But I don't just mean that in that way, but I also am very actually interested in people with differences, so commonly called disabilities. And if you look at the disability world, there is no one like you up there. There's gonna be no one like you. Most disabilities, most rare conditions are rare. They're really, really rare. There's no one else like you. So this trope that we have to see people that are like us, no. I mean, I just don't. I'm not a supporter of that. I think that we need to treat every single person for what they have to offer, and no matter how they look or where they come from. And so, yes, there are some access issues that we need to address for people that have been marginalized for reasons that are true for the whole group. And there are ways that we have to increase access for people who are marginalized because of singular reasons. And then other people who are just really, really good at what they do, no matter what they look like, they should be up there.
Competence first.
One of the, just hearing you say that makes me think about when I went to journalism school a long time ago and I studied broadcast journalism, they taught me how to talk like a man, which I don't know if you had a similar experience, but you know, the idea was like you were supposed to lower your voice. And I did that for a while, and I damaged my vocal cords. So if I have to like jump off stage, which I have to sometimes in public conversations, it's because I have a legitimate vocal cord problem from trying to lower my voice. And so now in our program, students ask about that, especially women. Like, well, tell me how to make myself sound more authoritative, and you know, the model years ago was to try to untrain women and try to teach them how to speak differently. And so now it's reversed. Now we spend a lot of time like, don't change anything. Like, just do what you do and don't worry about that, you know, and just do it. And there's a lot of research about women's voices and how it lowers trust in the public when they hear high voices. And the answer to that is not to lower our voice, but to put it out there more. So anyway, thank you for that. That made me think of this other thing.
Thank you so much. I think we heard 4 great voices, and I'm going to end it on that. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for talking to us. I hope you stay around a little bit. So if anybody wants to like talk to you a little further, they might do so. Thanks. We're going to, move on to the